Athanatophobology. Yes, it's a mouth and a mindful. Athanatophobology. As far as I know so far, I have coined that term as the study of not fearing death, or the study of, well, I mean, that's literally the translation. Athanatophobology. Thanatophobia would be the fear of death, and way too many people suffer from thanatophobia. It's in the way that suffer is used a lot of times, when it says that people suffer from, certain ailments and suffer from this and suffer from that. In this context, I really, really understand how appropriate it is. Because the fear of death, thanatophobia, is pervasive. It's almost a panacea. I mean, wait a minute, that's wrong. It's almost a pandemic. But, I mean, what would be the proper term? Because, I'm very literal sometimes, maybe a little bit too much. Because pandemic, pan means all, and the eem part comes from heme, which means blood, and ik means pertaining to. So pandemic literally means all blood pertaining to, or pertaining to all the blood, meaning something that's in everyone's blood. So originally, like, a pandemic is, a disease that gets in everybody's blood, right? So, but this is, I'll figure out what is it, hey, how about a new term? Would it be Panmemic? Panmemic, pertaining to in everyone's minds? So, we'll see. That might be appropriate. Panmemic. Okay, so we'll see if Panmemic is appropriate. I don't know. But what I do know is that, let me close these windows, it's going to be a little loud as I drive here. What I do know, however, is that the fear of death is something that so many people suffer from, and I am asserting, positing, claiming, stating that it is the underlying cause for so many issues that people face today. And because of their sympathetic nervous system, that kicks in fight, flight, and freeze. I'm focusing mostly on the freezing, or the catatonia, the inaction, the procrastination that the fear of death stimulates in many people. And the reason why I say it's panmemic, I'm just going to use that term right now, but the reason why I say it's panmemic in all minds, pretty much virtually in all minds, because of fear is not processed by many people in a very structured way. Even a lot of ancient rituals, for example, when a boy transitions to a man, like a bat mitzvah in Jewish religion, Jewish faith, or many indigenous cultures have, either hunting or survival rituals or rites of passage for their boys when they pass a certain age to become men. And in some Spanish-speaking cultures, there's the quinceañera at 15 years old. So, but not all of them. They're not all equal, but there's some remnants of them. Maybe some of them aren't as effective as others, because maybe some of them don't actually have real types of skill building or confidence building embedded in them. And my understanding from my experience is that the processing and the dealing with the facing of fear ought to be part of the curriculum or rites of passage of maturing and development in all people coming of age, not just the boys becoming men. And it's important because fear is deeply rooted in ancient superstition. But even before that, it has its roots in survival, and rightfully so. The way that the body reacts, how adrenaline kicks in, awareness, various other things, right? The fight or flight. What I'm saying is that what has happened with many people is it has been pushed so far into the unconscious and so it is a reaction that is basically a panicked hysteria without any functional and effective response, because that's the difference between a reaction and a response. So originally, yes, it's great that fear response is that whole system that kicks in, the sympathetic nervous system, that is, and that helps us to survive, right? It's self-preservation. But there needs to come a point in everyone's life where it is processed and first by consciously acknowledging what it is, right? So bringing it to the conscious mind, bringing it to conscious awareness. And hold on, I gotta punch in these numbers here. What does this say? Okay. Okay, hold on. I gotta pause here for a second. So again, I'm returning and I have to get this gate code punched in. So what I'm saying is that it's necessary for it to be acknowledged consciously and meditated upon intentionally, recognized every time that fear is felt, every time it's experienced, every time it comes up. We need to learn how to recognize it and then process it so that it becomes subconscious and it no longer is just a pure fear or dread that often results in very useless, panicked, hysterical behaviors. Now, while it's necessary for us to retain the various biological stimulations that happen in our bodies in order for us to have the increased strength, like the story you may have heard about a woman who lifted a car off of her child, or people who have these amazing feats of strength, speed, awareness, agility, all these things temporarily because their body gets kicked into that overdrive. So, and those things aren't necessarily fear. I mean, I'm sure that these people, some may have felt fear when these various things were going on. What I'm saying is that the fear component is not necessary, because a lot of fear gets pushed into the unconscious part of the mind and has never been dealt with, and therefore, because there's no training and awareness attached to it, it can be very problematic, and it manifests itself in various things that are irrational. So really, fear in a lot of people is not actually fear, it's actually a phobia. And the difference between fears and phobias are fears you have a direct connection to knowing exactly why, or having experiential contact with knowing why you fear something very specifically, very, very personally, very viscerally, where a phobia is just from the idea or thought of something and not necessarily actually having contact with something in order to fear it. Now, I know there's nuance there, and that you don't always have to, necessarily have been bitten by a poisonous spider and experienced all the terrible effects of that happening in order to know to be cautious around them. But once again, there's a difference between fear and caution and intelligent self-preservation. I shall return. So what's happening is that many, many humans are not in command of, or at the very least aware that the responses to various different threats, or even the perception of threat, because not all things that we perceive are actually threatening. Sometimes it's just a perception. There was a very often used example of how the people would be walking somewhere, like hiking, for example. It could be any kind of scenario, but they would look over and see a snake and jump, and their heart, it would beat faster. They would have all this panic and stuff like that, and then upon closer inspection realize it was just a very peculiarly curved or shaped stick, or just the way that the light was hitting it, it seemed like a snake. But even then, the reaction that is panic and fear, I am asserting, is not necessary for self-preservation. And the body can still have those internal responses where the biochemicals and things get ramped up enough so that your body can react when it needs to, but it doesn't need to. Your mind doesn't need to be blocked out. It's not necessary for panic to drive your thoughts into all kinds of incoherent directions, all kinds of images, all kinds of unknowns, which happens a lot. And I know that we can shut off and go to different places in our minds. So a good example, I was in the marching band I started in band by following my older sister way back since the 6th grade. And then in high school, I continued in marching band, starting with Fort Lauderdale High School in 9th grade and 10th grade, then dropped out of school for a year, and then restarted again at Northeast High School, both of them in Fort Lauderdale. Northeast High School in a little subsection called Oakland Park, and continue with the marching band in the 11th and 12th grade. And something that was really fascinating was that I remembered an experience that I have on the field, is that we would, during band camp, during the summer, we would drill these different field positions so much over and over again that one very interesting experience I remember was of how when the competition finally came and we had to do the entire program from beginning to end, right, and execute that entire sequence on the field and hit our positions and formations and all that, especially during competitions, but we did it, at football games and things like that. And the great thing, what was interesting, is that as far as I can remember, both John D. Nista, who was my band teacher in Fort Lauderdale High School, and then Steve Salo, who was my band teacher at Northeast High School, as far as I can remember, we did the same exact formations and positions during all the football games as we would eventually be doing during the competition. So we didn't have to learn anything different. We just maybe, I know we went on field trips and then had special competition uniforms to wear on the field. But other than that, everything was the same. And what would happen is that my body would be hitting all of the formations and everything would be perfect. And I can confidently say perfect for some reason in both Fort Lauderdale High School and when I was in Northeast High School, the years that I was there, for some reason we always won first place in all of those types of competitions. So everybody was hitting everything. We were all in sync. We were all hitting our positions perfectly. And it was all, relative to the person who was next to you, in front of you, behind you, all that. And so, but the one feature that I remember would be that I would go through all of those various different positions and everything, and not really be aware of it. Like, I would just vaguely be aware that I'm doing stuff, but like I'm playing all the notes and hitting all the spots, and then it would be done and the crowd would be cheering or be finished, and then I would come out of like this dream state. Like I completely went into a different mode. And and even that, it comes from training, and even being a little bit anxious or nervous and wanting to win, like caring about the result. I can say that there might be some things that are related to fear in those components, but it's not the same thing. I really I really understand, and my experience is that through training, we can bring ourselves to that level where there's not a fear there. There may be excitement is the best word for it, because we do get excited and stimulated, but it's not fear, because I know all the positions that I had to take. I knew all the notes to play from practicing it hundreds and hundreds of times, and sometimes even more than that, being at home, how I was also just very much a perfectionist. I would practice all the time. Like everything that I do is I'm constantly doing it. And so like I'm always finding some way or the other to think about music, to think about martial arts, to think about philosophy, science, and spirituality, my 3 M's, metaphysics, music, and martial arts, and in some way apply it. To think of lyrics, to think of melodies, to think of harmony, to think of various different movement sequences, and just on and on and on. It's just I'm in a constant state of some kind of rehearsal or practice or training for these things that I really am passionate about doing. I think I'm pretty sure that that's what, one of the characteristics of being passionate about something is just this obsession where like nobody has to tell me to do anything. Nobody has to motivate me to do any of these things. I'm addicted on a very deep level where I dare to say that I really almost can't help myself. Like it's almost impossible for me not to. Like it feels bad to not train and do martial arts movements, to write lyrics, compose music, and to philosophize and think deeply about not only the music and the lyrics and the instruments and the martial arts, but just almost anything that I come across. People, the way that they look, how they're dressed, the color of their hair, eyes, and skin. Like I'm just thinking about all of the aspects of my existence all the time, and running comparisons and juxtapositions against other experiences and other just data. I'm an information vampire, and I'm just processing all of the things that I'm consuming in this obsessive way to synthesize and think of some novel way to approach and apply what it is I'm thinking about and what it is I know in my life. And so about fear, from all of these various experiences that I have and just the obsessive type of practice and processing that I have, I've realized that the same thing can be applied to fear, but a lot of people do not. And there are a lot of other things that I apply cognitive processes to and analysis, and that are related, and I'm just going to mention them just for context. But I do the same thing with hunger. I do the same thing with fatigue. I do the same thing with sexual arousal. I do the same thing with pain. In the past, when I used to drink alcohol and smoke cannabis and use acid and ecstasy, I would internalize and analyze the experiences while I was intoxicated and after. And I would also be preparing for it beforehand, which is one of the reasons probably why on the hallucinogens I've never had a bad experience. I've had some very interesting experiences, but never any what so-called bad ones. I've never had what people call bad trips. Now, alcohol I can't say the same for. Tobacco, pretty bad stuff, but no bad experiences with acid or ecstasy for some reason, or cannabis. But yeah, alcohol, cigarettes, when I did take some pharmaceutical drugs before, I had one really bad experience, and that was the end of it. When I was 19, this guy named Mark Bird, he was like 31 years old, I was 19, and he gave me Klonopin and Jack Daniels, and I was out for 3 days. I think that you might call that a coma. And I actually got arrested for aggravated assault and aggravated battery against him. So he claimed, even though this guy Mike Bowden, yes, I'm calling you guys out, was the one who perpetrated the crime against him. Mike Bowden put a fork on the stove and heated it up and claimed that it was a gang initiation, and burned this guy Mark Bird, who I think might have been in some ways mentally impaired somehow. I don't know if it's from the Klonopin or he was on the Klonopin for that, but either way, he shouldn't have been sharing with a 19-year-old alcohol or his prescription medication. And then I got accused of that. I pled down and got them dropped to misdemeanor, so thankfully in my life I don't have any felonies. But I could have, if I would have known it better, I could have used that as a counter complaint and gotten all the charges dropped. But yeah, so my point is that I've never had any bad experiences with certain things, and that the whole point though is that I have always made it a point to internalize the experiences that I've had and find a way to process them to make them useful. And this is because of my mother, who the first time I smoked weed was when I was 17 with a friend Mike, and we were inside my room. I remember watching Beavis and Butthead. My mom barged in and said, "Is that really all that you can do? Is that really what your life is about? You're gonna just do drugs, whatever?" And she gave us a real talking to. And then the next day, she talked to me about how, there are, different shamans and things like that. She talked about the Kalinagos people that were, actually, I later learned about the Kalinagos people that her family is partly related to, from the islands in Trinidad where they're from. And just learned just a lot of ritualistic things, and that people go into these various different shamanic states and do spirit walking and dream walking and all this. And that really impacted me very much, to the point where every time I would get intoxicated in any way, shape, or form, or anything time that I knew that I was going to be, I would do my best to see if I could learn from the experience. And like I said, with alcohol, tobacco, and other stuff like that, there was really not much. I mean, I always learned something, but those are just bad, really super toxic experiences that I'm so glad that I will not be experiencing again. I don't do anything at all. I'm completely straight edge now, but those were some pretty bad times. And So, yeah, anyway, I'm going to have to get back to this. I got another task to do, so we'll see in a moment. I shall return. So, what I'm leading up to here, talking about processing the experiences, whether they were in the past, intoxication and fear, is for the practice of redirecting the energy of the stimulus, like redirecting the force. So one example that I think is a really good one, and it shows a partial use of this because it's incomplete. Not that it's ineffective, but it's incomplete to what I'm talking about of, Athanatophobology, the study of not being afraid of death. That's kind of clumsy saying that, the study of not being afraid of death, even clumsier than Athanatophobology. So, but we'll clean that up sometime later. But Tim McCarthy, who was a Secret Service agent who worked for, under the direction of President Ronald Reagan, he jumped in front of a bullet and caught a bullet in his gut in 1981 in March. I think it was March 31st or something like that of 1981. Maybe I was 3.5 years old. I remember hearing about it. There's a lot of things I remember from when I was really young. Maybe because of just really being very hyper vigilant, as one of my mentors, Elaine Perlis from the Hypnosis Motivation Institute, said to me when I was doing my clinical residency. And evidence of my hypervigilance, I remember telling her once about, I was in the car with my friend Kevin, and I said, "Hey, I think your phone is ringing." And so I'm in the passenger seat, he's driving, and his phone was in his left pocket, which is all the way to the far left. I'm in the far right of the car, and I knew his phone was going off before he did. He said to me, he said, "How the hell?" But it could have been also the wind, maybe because of how close he was to his window. His left ear was being, the sound was being obscured by that, and my left ear wasn't, because it wasn't as close to it. I don't know. But, she said, and other experiences that I talked to her about, she says, they talked about it being hypervigilant and probably having to do with traumas or micro traumas. Either way, with Tim McCarthy, what he did was he jumped in front of a bullet. And in order to do that, you have to go through rigorous and extensive training to do so, right? Because there's an automatic fear response that we learn about guns and the pain and the fear of death. And so, we usually duck and cover when there are bullets. But his job was to use his body as a shield so that those bullets, the one that hit him in the gut, didn't reach the president. And so, now, the thing is, and I've never spoken to the man, I haven't really read anything much about the situation beyond what I'm really talking about here now, so I can't really speak to what was going on with him internally, but my guess is, because I'm familiar with a lot of other training, like martial arts training and other things that are similar in military training, and speaking to people who've gone through boot camp and Navy SEAL training and things like that, that the thing is that this is an extreme physical example of fearing something and doing it anyway, right? And so he may very well have felt fear, but the energy was redirected of what one does. So in place of the chaos that could be any number of things that a person starts to think when they are faced with a situation like that, being shot at, people's thoughts go to all kinds of religious things, the end of life, their family, like all these panicked and hysterical types of things, and the pain they're going to feel and the discomfort, and what if they don't survive, and they feel sad, like all of these things just hit them. This is what it means, in essence, when somebody says their whole life flashed before their eyes, right? Is just they get flooded with all kinds of thoughts, senses, emotions, memories, and things like that, because they're panicking. And so what happens is that in that kind of training, and I'm speculating here, right, to make the point, that all of that stuff that could have been redirected to cowering, right? Cowering is like, closing your eyes and ducking and falling on the floor, or running away, or running into things that people do when they have no training, right? But instead, in its place of what all that, because he very well could still have had all of that light flashing before his eyes stuff happening, right? All that panicked, hysterical stuff. But what is done with that is that what the response is put in its place. There's a different physical response put in its place, and that's the important part for his job. I don't think anybody cares what he was thinking or how he feels, right? I'm being very harsh and just real here, but whether or not he gets the job done, right? Which is to not let the president get hit by the bullets and he get hit by the bullet instead. The president, and for all intents and purposes in this situation, is more important. The president's life is more important than the Secret Service agent's life for that situation. So now what I am saying is that not only can you train out the chaotic